London, the Seville Theater, June 4th, 1967. Sunday night. The curtains flew back. Jimi Hendrix walked forward, guitar already screaming, and launched into a song that the audience barely recognized, because it had been released just 3 days earlier. Thursday, June 1st. The Beatles released the most anticipated album in the history of rock and roll. Sunday, June 4th. Jimi Hendrix opened his show by playing the title track, live, on stage, having learned it in 72 hours. And sitting in the audience, watching this impossible feat unfold, was Paul McCartney himself. It was, Paul would say decades later, the ultimate compliment. This is the story of how Jimi Hendrix learned the most complex song the Beatles had ever written in 3 days, performed it in front of its creator, and earned the respect that would change his career forever. To understand what Jimi Hendrix did on June 4th, 1967, you have to understand what the Beatles had just done 3 days earlier. They'd released an album called Sgt.Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Not just another album. The album. The one that would redefine what rock music could be. What albums could be. What recording itself could accomplish. The Beatles had stopped touring in August 1966. No more screaming crowds drowning out the music. No more playing the same songs the same way every night. They'd retreated to Abbey Road Studios and spent months creating something unprecedented. Multi-track recording, orchestra sections, sound effects, songs that bled into each other. A concept, an experience. The title track opened the album like a curtain rising on a show. Orchestral sounds, a live audience ambience. Paul McCartney's voice inviting everyone to witness something special. Then the guitars kicked in, thick, distorted, rocking, and the song announced, "This is different." The song itself was complex. Key changes, time signature shifts, layered guitars and vocals. It sounded simple on first listen, but try to play it? Different story. When the album hit stores on Thursday, June 1st, 1967, it was an instant cultural earthquake. Record stores couldn't keep it in stock. Radio stations played it on repeat. Music journalists called it revolutionary. And in London, every musician who mattered bought a copy immediately, including Jimi Hendrix. Jimi had been in London since September 1966. 9 months. In that time, he'd gone from complete unknown to the talk of the town. Chas Chandler, former bassist of the Animals, had discovered Jimi in a New York club and brought him to England. Formed the Jimi Hendrix Experience with Noel Redding on bass and Mitch Mitchell on drums. Released 3 singles that hit the UK top 10. But more importantly, Jimi had earned the respect of London's musical elite. Eric Clapton had watched Jimi play and felt his confidence as God shatter. Pete Townsend of The Who knew that following Jimi on stage was impossible. Jeff Beck, Jimmy Page, every guitarist in London understood they were witnessing someone operating on a different level. And the Beatles, who'd stopped performing live, who'd become studio wizards, who were creating the future in Abbey Road. They'd noticed Jimi too. Paul McCartney had first seen Jimi perform on January 11th, 1967, at a tiny club called the Bag O' Nails on Kingly Street in Soho. Paul loved that place. It was one of his regular haunts. After long Beatles recording sessions at Abbey Road, he'd head there late at night to decompress, have a drink, watch whatever band happened to be playing. The Bag O' Nails was cramped, sweaty, dimly lit. The kind of basement club where you could smell the beer and cigarettes before you even descended the stairs. The stage was just a corner platform. Nothing fancy, but it had become the meeting place for London's musicians. Everyone went there. The Who, the Animals, Eric Burdon, anyone who mattered in the scene. That January night, Paul arrived late. Very late. Maybe 2 in the morning. The club was essentially empty. Most people had gone home. Just a handful of stragglers remained. And then Paul heard a sound. That distinctive clunk of a jack plug being pushed into an amplifier. The hum of electricity waiting to become music. He looked toward the stage in the corner. 3 musicians were setting up. Or rather, they'd already set up and were about to play. A young black man with a wild afro, holding a Fender Stratocaster. A bassist with long hair. A drummer positioned behind a minimal kit. Paul didn't know who they were. Hadn't heard of them. But something about the way the guitarist held his instrument, the confidence, the ease, made Paul stay. The Jimi Hendrix Experience launched into their set, playing to virtually no one, playing as if they were at Wembley Stadium instead of a nearly empty basement club at 2 in the morning. And Paul McCartney, who'd played thousands of shows, who'd seen every great musician of his generation, who knew talent when he encountered it, watched that guitarist and understood immediately. This was different. Not just good, not just technically skilled, different in a fundamental way. The way Jimmy's fingers moved across the fretboard, the sounds he coaxed from that Stratocaster, the confidence radiating from him even in this tiny, empty space. The complete integration between musician and instrument, like the guitar was part of his body, an extension of his nervous system. I certainly love Jimmy, Paul said years later, describing that first encounter. I was one of the first people to see him in London, and it was mind-blowing. When did Paul know? When did the realization hit that he was watching something extraordinary? Probably the first minute. The first second that he started playing guitar. That fast. 1 second. Paul stayed for the entire set. Watched Jimmy play to an empty room with the same intensity he'd bring to a packed arena. Watched him experiment, take risks, push boundaries. And when it was over, Paul knew he'd witnessed the future. From that moment, Paul became a champion of Jimi Hendrix. But it wasn't just that one late-night encounter. January 11th was also the night the Jimi Hendrix Experience had 2 official shows at the Bag O' Nails. Earlier in the evening, before Paul's late arrival, the club had been packed. Ringo Starr had been there, Pete Townsend and John Entwistle from The Who, Bill Wyman from the Rolling Stones, Eric Clapton. Virtually every major British blues guitarist had crammed into that basement to see what everyone was whispering about. The word was out. There's this American guitarist playing London clubs who's unlike anyone we've ever seen. And they'd all come to witness it, to understand, to see if the hype was real. It was real. One by one, they'd left that club understanding that the rules had changed. That Jimi Hendrix had just moved the goalposts for what guitar playing could be. Paul got it too. And unlike some musicians who might have felt threatened or competitive, Paul's response was simple. This guy needs to be heard, needs support, needs promotion. So Paul started talking him up. Everywhere. To everyone. He reviewed Jimmy's single, Purple Haze, for Melody Maker magazine in February 1967. Gave it high praise. Jimmy freaks out and sounds all the better for it. It's breaking out all over the place. You can't stop it. Hooray. Paul told anyone who'd listen, watch this guy. He's special. And Jimmy knew it. Knew that Paul McCartney, a Beatle, for God's sake, was paying attention. Respected his work. So when the Sgt.Pepper album dropped on June 1st, Jimmy didn't just listen to it as a fan. He studied it. June 4th was a Sunday. Jimmy was headlining at the Seville Theater in London's West End. A proper venue. 1,500 seats. Brian Epstein, the Beatles' manager, owned it and rented it out on Sundays when it was normally dark. Jimmy knew Paul and George Harrison would be in attendance that night. Word had gotten around. The Beatles were coming to see him play. Most musicians would be nervous. Play it safe. Stick to the hits. Jimmy decided to do something audacious. He was going to open the show by playing the title track from Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the album that had been out for 3 days. His bandmates, Noel and Mitch, must have thought he was crazy. Learn a Beatles song in 72 hours? A complex one, and open with it? In front of the Beatles themselves? But Jimmy was confident. He had the record. He had his guitar. And he had an ability that very few musicians possessed. He could hear something once and understand it completely. Backstage at the Seville Theater, before the show, Jimmy set up a portable record player. Put on the Sgt. Pepper album. Listened. And played along. The song wasn't simple. The rhythm shifted. The chords moved in unexpected ways. There were stops and starts. Orchestral flourishes you couldn't replicate with just 3 musicians. But Jimmy found the essence of it. The core. The riff that drove it forward. The energy that made it rock. He wasn't trying to replicate the Beatles' studio version perfectly. That would be pointless. The Beatles had spent months with an orchestra and multi-track recording creating that sound. Jimmy was going to do what he always did. Take a song and make it his own. Turn it into something explosive. Something that worked with 3 musicians playing live, loud, and raw. Noel and Mitch caught on. They were professional musicians. They could follow Jimmy anywhere. If he said, "We're opening with this," they figured it out. And as showtime approached, word spread backstage. Jimmy was going to play a Beatles song. From the new album. The one that came out 3 days ago. People wondered if he'd pull it off. If it would work. If the Beatles in the audience would be offended or impressed. Jimmy didn't care. He knew what he was doing. Paul McCartney and George Harrison arrived at the Seville Theater that night with no idea what was about to happen. They'd come to see Jimmy play, support him, watch the guitarist everyone was talking about. The bill that night was stacked. Procol Harum was on it. Their song, A Whiter Shade of Pale, had just hit #1 that very day. Denny Laine and his electric string band. The Chiffons. It was a solid lineup. But everyone was there for Jimi Hendrix. The lights went down. The crowd settled. The curtains began to open. And before anyone could see him, they heard him. Guitar already screaming. That thick, distorted, unmistakable Hendrix tone cutting through the theater. Then the curtains flew back completely. Jimmy stood there, walking forward, and the opening riff of Sgt.Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band exploded through the room. The audience, those who recognized it, gasped. It had been out for 3 days. 3 days. And here was Jimi Hendrix, playing it live, making it sound like he'd been performing it for years. Paul McCartney sat there stunned. George Harrison too. This was their song, their album, their work, released 72 hours ago. And Jimmy had absorbed it, internalized it, and transformed it into a Hendrix song. The performance wasn't a carbon copy of the album. It couldn't be. The experience were 3 people with guitars and drums. The Beatles version had orchestra, overdubs, studio magic. But Jimmy captured the spirit, the energy, the rock and roll heart of it. His guitar screamed where the orchestra had swelled. Mitch Mitchell's drums pounded with precision. Noel's bass held it all together. And Jimmy, guitar slung low, afro magnificent, presence undeniable, turned a 3-day-old song into a statement. It said, I respect what you did. I understand it. And I can take it to the stage. The crowd erupted. And Paul McCartney sat there with a smile spreading across his face. After the show, Paul couldn't stop talking about it. Jimmy was a sweetie, a very nice guy. Paul remembered. I remember him opening at the Saville on a Sunday night, June 4th, 1967. Brian Epstein used to rent it when it was usually dark on the Sunday. Jimmy opened, the curtains flew back, and he came walking forward, playing Sgt.Pepper, and it had only been released on the Thursday, so that was like the ultimate compliment. The ultimate compliment. Not just that Jimmy played the song, but that he'd learned it so fast, cared enough to learn it, respected the work enough to open his show with it. It's still obviously a shining memory for me, Paul said years later. Because I admired him so much anyway, he was so accomplished. To think that that album had meant so much to him as to actually do it by the Sunday night, 3 days after the release. He must have been so into it. Paul was right. Jimmy was into it. Because Jimmy understood something fundamental. Music was a conversation. Artists spoke to each other through their work. Through covers, influences, innovations. The Beatles had pushed rock and roll forward with Sgt. Pepper. Showed what was possible. And Jimmy, by learning that song in 3 days and performing it live in front of its creators, was saying, I hear you. I understand. And I'm ready to push it even further. The impact of that moment went beyond just the performance. Paul McCartney became an even bigger champion of Jimmy after that night. And Paul's support mattered immensely. Because the Beatles weren't just another band. They were the band. The biggest cultural force in the world. Their opinion shaped the industry. Their endorsement could make or break careers. When Paul talked about an artist, people listened. And Paul couldn't stop talking about Jimi Hendrix. He'd tell anyone who'd listen, this is the future. This is what's coming. Watch this guy. In February 1967, Paul was invited to do a blind date feature for Melody Maker magazine, where musicians reviewed new singles without knowing who the artist was. When Jimmy's Purple Haze came on, Paul recognized it immediately. Must be Jimi Hendrix, Paul said, not even pretending to be blind to the artist. So, Jimmy freaks out and sounds all the better for it. It's breaking out all over the place, you know. He continued, with genuine enthusiasm. I thought it would be one of those things that people might keep down, but it's breaking through all over. You can't stop it. Hooray. This is a good record too. That wasn't just a musician being polite about another musician's work. That was Paul McCartney, at the peak of the Beatles' powers, while creating Sgt. Pepper, taking time to publicly champion an emerging artist. And it mattered. But the real impact of Paul's advocacy came 2 weeks after the Seville Theater performance. The Monterey International Pop Festival was scheduled for mid-June 1967 in California. It would be the first major American rock festival. A three-day event showcasing the best emerging and established talent. A defining moment for the counterculture. John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas was one of the organizers. Along with Lou Adler, he was putting together a lineup that would represent the cutting edge of rock music. The problem for Jimi Hendrix: he was still virtually unknown in America. In the UK, Jimi was a sensation. 3 top 10 singles, packed clubs, newspaper features. Everyone who mattered knew his name. But in America, his home country, the place he'd left to find success, Jimi couldn't get arrested. His first 2 US singles had flopped. Hey Joe didn't chart at all. Purple Haze limped to number 65. His album, Are You Experienced, wasn't even scheduled for American release until late August. To most Americans, Jimi Hendrix was nobody. The Monterey organizers weren't sure about putting him on the bill. Unknown artist. No American track record. Was he worth the slot? Paul McCartney made it his mission to get Jimi onto that festival. He contacted John Phillips directly, urged him, insisted, made the case. You have to have Jimi Hendrix. He's incredible. He's going to be massive. This is a mistake if you don't book him. Paul's enthusiasm, coming from a Beatle, coming from someone whose judgment the industry trusted, convinced them. Jimi got the slot. And on June 18, 1967, 14 days after playing Sgt.Pepper at the Seville Theater, Jimi Hendrix took the stage at Monterey and delivered the performance that changed everything. The guitar burning, the sexuality, the transcendence. The moment that entered rock mythology and announced to America, Jimi Hendrix has arrived. That performance, which made Jimi a star in his own country, which launched his American career, which became one of the most iconic moments in rock history, happened because Paul McCartney had seen him play Sgt.Pepper 2 weeks earlier and picked up the phone. The Seville Theater performance wasn't just a great cover. It was a catalyst, a validation, a moment where one genius recognized another and decided, I'm going to use my power to help this person reach the audience they deserve. Without Paul's advocacy, Monterey might not have happened. Without Monterey, Jimi's American breakthrough might have taken years longer, or might not have happened at all. One cover song, learned in 3 days, performed in front of its creator. And from that, a career trajectory changed. History altered. Jimi would continue to play the title track from Sgt.Pepper at various shows throughout 1967. It became part of his repertoire, a tribute, a connection between him and the Beatles. He played it at the Hollywood Bowl on August 18, 1967. Recordings of that version would eventually be released decades later. Fans could hear how Jimi took that song and made it explode with his signature sound. He never did it the same way twice. That wasn't how Jimi worked. Each performance was different, responding to the room, the mood, what his fingers wanted to do in that moment. But every time he played it, he carried that same energy from the Seville Theater. The respect, the understanding, the desire to honor what the Beatles had created while making it his own. The story of Jimi learning Sgt.Pepper in 3 days has become legendary because it captures something essential about who he was. Most musicians, given 3 days with a complex new song, would either decline to perform it or deliver a rough approximation. Jimi absorbed it completely, found its essence, transformed it, and delivered it with such confidence that the people who'd written it sat there amazed. That ability, to hear something once and understand it deeply, was part of Jimi's genius. He didn't just have technical skill. He had musical instinct that operated on a different level. Paul McCartney recognized that, called it accomplished, said Jimi's attention to the album showed how much it meant to him. And it did mean something to Jimi. The Beatles had shown that rock music could be art, could be experimental, could break rules and still connect with millions of people. Jimi wanted to do the same thing. Push boundaries. Create sounds no one had heard before. Make the guitar do things it wasn't supposed to do. The Beatles were doing it in the studio. Jimi was doing it on stage. And on June 4, 1967, those two approaches met. Studio wizards in the audience. Stage magician on the platform. Both understanding that they were part of something larger. A movement. An evolution. There's a detail Paul mentioned years later that adds another layer to the story. During Jimi's performance, at some point his guitar went out of tune from all the whammy bar dive bombing. Common in a Jimi performance. He bent notes until the strings couldn't take it anymore. Paul remembered that Jimi turned to the audience, where Eric Clapton was also sitting, and asked Clapton to come on stage and retune the guitar for him. Clapton, reportedly, demurred, maybe too shy, maybe didn't want to interrupt the flow. But the image is perfect. Jimi Hendrix, the most innovative guitarist on the planet, casually asking Eric Clapton, considered a god in his own right, to come tune his guitar mid-performance. That's the confidence Jimi operated with. The comfort, the understanding that they were all musicians, all equals, all trying to make something beautiful. 57 years have passed since June 4, 1967. The Seville Theater is long gone. Brian Epstein died later that same year. The Beatles broke up in 1970. Jimi died in September of that year, at 27. But that moment, the curtains flying back, Jimi walking forward playing Sgt.Pepper 3 days after its release, Paul McCartney watching with a smile, endures. It endures because it represents something pure. Respect between artists. The joy of creation. The understanding that music is a conversation that never ends. Paul McCartney still tells this story. At concerts, in interviews, whenever Jimi's name comes up, it's a shining memory for him. Something he returns to again and again. Because he knows what it meant. Not just that Jimi covered his song, but that Jimi cared enough to learn it immediately. To honor it. To show Paul, your work matters. I'm listening. And I'm going to take what you did and push it further. 3 days. That's all it took for Jimi Hendrix to learn one of the most complex songs the Beatles had ever written. And one performance. That's all it took for Paul McCartney to understand. Jimi Hendrix needed to be heard in America. Needed to be at Monterey. Needed to become what he was destined to be. The ultimate compliment. From Jimi to the Beatles. From the Beatles back to Jimi. And from that moment, a connection that would echo through rock and roll history. London. The Seville Theater. June 4, 1967. The night Jimi Hendrix proved that genius recognizes genius. And sometimes, all it takes is 72 hours and a guitar.